Hey, what's up guys? My name is Cherno. Welcome back to my game engine series, or the Hazel engine series as I guess I can call it now. Last time we talked about setting up a basic Visual Studio project and solution and all of that, and actually having kind of our Hazel library link against a sandbox application. If you guys haven't seen that episode, make sure you check it out because that was the first episode in which we wrote any code. In this episode, we're going to continue on with writing code. We kind of just wrote more of a test last time that really just showed kind of how we could interact, I guess, between that static library or the dynamic library that we built, which was our Hazel engine, and then also the actual sandbox application that we have. But it was really rough, and today we're going to set it up a little bit more properly, and specifically we're going to actually start by creating an entry point. So let's talk a little bit about what that actually means. So when we talk about kind of writing applications, I guess, there's always an entry point to that application, unless it's like some kind of static library. Like even dynamic libraries have entry points, and we can kind of talk about that, I think, a little bit later in this series as well. But essentially, our application needs to start somewhere, right? What happens when we launch our application? Well, certain code will essentially run. And then from there, we probably want to somewhat take control and say, well, okay, all of this kind of engine startup code needs to actually happen. Now, there's many different ways that we could do it. For example, because our engine is a DLL file, DLL files also have kind of a main function. So basically, we're allowed to call certain code when either we attach that DLL process or when we detach it. So in other words, if our application loads the DLL or unloads the DLL, we can kind of hook into those events and just say, I want to run this code, and that's fine. But because we are building kind of an engine that is essentially an application engine at its core, I mean, sure, it's a game engine, but what is a game engine, right? A game engine is essentially a real-time kind of application engine. It doesn't just have to apply to games, and certainly Hazel is not necessarily, I probably might not even brand it necessarily as a game engine because it's capable of so much more than that, and it will be capable of so much more than that. So because we kind of it's an engine on which we can build applications, it's kind of important for us essentially to just be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to provide a way for Hazel applications to actually create their entry point. We could just write a main function in our application. In fact, if we look over at the code that we currently have, we have this application.cpp file, which is inside Sandbox, and that just has, maybe I'll just make this a bit bigger. We just have that main function, void main, and that calls Hazel print, and all that stuff's fine. Basically what I'm saying is I don't want this to be here, because this means that this kind of, how the main function is defined is up to the application, whereas this is something that I would like to take control of from the engine side. So that's what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be kind of a simple setup. I don't think it will take too long. Just as a short kind of disclaimer with everything in this series obviously I'm writing as I go, and as any kind of software engineering project is done, this is subject to change in the future. So if I decide that actually, like, let's do it a bit differently, like, this is not final code in any sense. We're writing a game engine together. I haven't got a game engine written and then I'm just showing you step by step how I got to that end product. No, we're writing an engine together here. So obviously things may change over time. But anyway, without further ado, let's just jump in and start programming, and I'm just going to show you guys how to make an entry point. We're also going to make an application class that will essentially be a way for us to actually like launch our application and define an application inside our Sandbox project. And we're also probably going to need to get that decal spec DLL import and export functions into a macro so that we can actually, reuse header files and not do what we've done here, which is essentially having to manually kind of import this void print thing, manually have this function declaration here with a DLL import, and then over here, as you can see, we had that export. So anyway, the first thing that I want to do is inside the source, I'm going to add a new folder called Hazel. And everything's kind of going to go into here. So this is going to be kind of the Hazel core library. This test stuff, I'm just going to flat out delete because I don't care about any of that. And then inside Hazel, I'm going to make a few new items. I really want to make something called, I'm going to make something called core.h, which for now I'm calling it core.h. This will have some basic macros to begin with. And I also want to make my kind of application, I can probably just make a C++ class called application, and then hopefully it will create a header file for me and a CPP file. Let's just hit OK. That's pretty basic, just saves a bit of typing. If I alt over here, you can see we've got some definitions as well. So I'll start by taking this application class and putting it into the Hazel namespace. The Hazel namespace is, we didn't talk too much about naming or anything like that, but essentially everything is going to be in the Hazel namespace, and for macros, they will most likely be shortened to HZ, like that. Instead of kind of making an HZ namespace like this, which you could do, that's quite a popular approach. For now, at least, well, I don't know, for this Hazel engine, I've decided to kind of go with the actual full word like that. And if we switch over to the CPP file, I'm going to do the exact same thing, namespace Hazel, and we're going to wrap it like that. I'm going to write a void run here, which is basically just going to run our application. And for now, this is going to be incredibly simple. I'm literally just going to stick a while true loop in here like that, just so that we can kind of just have an infinitely running application that won't close for now. The other thing that's really important to do is make this destructor virtual, because this class will actually be inherited, well, subclassed by our actual sandbox application. Because the way that we're going to write this, as you see in a minute, is essentially we're going to make our own application which inherits from Hazel application. Okay, cool. That's looking pretty good to me. We have the big problem here of having to actually DACL spec DLL export and import, depending on where it's kind of written, this actual application like this. Okay, so in order to actually use this class inside Sandbox, because this is a DLL, we need to export it from that Hazel DLL. So when we build this Hazel DLL, this needs to be DLL export. And then when we include application.h inside application.cpp in our Sandbox project, this actually needs to be DLL import. The same way that we had with our print function, except here it's with the entire class. So to do this and to make it a lot easier for ourselves, we're actually going to go to that core header file that we made. By the way, application should be inside that Hazel thing, so I'm just going to move it into there. Inside core, I'm just going to define a macro that is either DLL import or export, depending on whether or not we're building this DLL file. So the way we're going to do that is very simple. First of all, DECL spec DLL export and import is a Windows only thing. So I'm going to say if def hz platform Windows. Okay, so this only applies to Windows. One more level deep, I'll say if def hz build DLL, which means we're trying to build this DLL, this macro will be defined for this actual Hazel project, but not for Sandbox. We're going to say define Hazel API as DECL spec DLL export, and if, or rather else, we're going to define it as import. Okay, and I mean we could just put like a simple kind of else, error, Hazel only supports Windows, because that's all we support for now, okay? Just so that this basically will trigger an error and won't build if no platforms are defined, which for now I guess is just this. So we're going to grab this, we're going to right click on Hazel, go to properties. Inside Hazel property pages for all configurations and for our x64 platform, under C++ preprocessor, we're going to define a couple of macros. So first of all, we'll put a couple of definitions in. HZ platform Windows will be something that I'll put in here, of course, and this actually also needs to go into Sandbox. So I'll click on Sandbox and put HZ platform Windows, okay? Making sure that we have a semicolon. And then additionally in Hazel, I'm going to put a macro called Hazel build DLL. I call them macros, they're really just definitions or defines, but there we go. So Hazel build DLL, okay? So that's what we've got in here, which means that this kind of export should be active when we build the Hazel library, but for Sandbox, this import should be active. So if we go to application.h, I'll include core.h, and then we'll just say class Hazel API application, just like that, okay? So now that we've done that, what essentially that means is that if we go into our application.cpp, which is in Sandbox, this is becoming a little bit confusing because both of these files are called application.cpp. So I'm actually going to rename this file to sandbox.cpp or maybe sandboxapp.cpp, just so that we kind of get rid of that confusion. Now what I want to do is I don't really want to, in my sandbox application, have to do stuff like include, hazel/application.cpp. That's kind of hard to use, right? What I actually want to be able to do, essentially, is just say I want to include hazel.h, like that, okay? And that should sort out everything for me. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, inside source over here, I'm going to add a new item called hazel.h, and this will kind of be like a header file that is only intended to be included by client applications. So Hazel will never include this. You can see it's actually outside of Hazel. This is just kind of for use by applications. So this is for use by Hazel applications. Okay, and inside here we're going to include Hazel stuff. So include Hazel application, maybe Hazel core, whatever. We don't really need to include core, but you kind of get the point. We're just going to put everything that we need kind of into here, and then this will be included here. So to make this kind of work, we're going to right click on Sandbox, hit Properties. We're going to go to C++ General, and as an additional include directory, I'm going to say solution directory, and then Hazel, and then \source, like that. So we're adding this source folder as an include directory in Sandbox so that we can actually either do that, or it doesn't really matter if we use Angular brackets or not. But the point is we can kind of use a compiler include path either like this or like this to actually include Hazel. And we don't have to use relative paths. Okay, cool. So that's it. That's done. Let's think about writing an actual application now. So we can say class sandbox is public Hazel application. Okay, we can do a number of things here. Let's maybe just have a basic constructor and destructor, which for now will do nothing. And then, I mean, we don't really need to do much here, but basically the idea is we kind of have a skeleton class, which is a Hazel application. And the idea now is that we kind of want to run it, maybe by doing something like sandbox equals new sandbox. We're going to allocate it on the heap like this for now, making sure to delete it later, and then we'll do something like sandbox run. So that's what we basically want to do, okay? I don't want to do this inside sandbox app.cpp because this should be somewhat handled. This should basically be handled by the engine and not by the application. We're heap allocating it because sandbox can potentially be very large, and we do want to control the lifetime of this explicitly because it is literally our entire application. So this does, I definitely want to be explicit with memory when it comes to this. But if we run this, it should actually work and hopefully just bring up, okay, well in this case we actually get an error, which is fantastic. So what does it say here? Okay, inconsistent DLL linkage. Okay, so it's not happy with our DLL linkage, in fact. Yeah, so there's something wrong with the Hazel API macro probably. Let's just see what we actually define that as. Because it should be Hazel build DLL. Okay, I see. So we used HZ build DLL here and Hazel build DLL here. So let's just get rid of Hazel. We'll just say HZ build DLL like that. And hit OK. So now it should actually export that properly. Let's build this Hazel project, and then we'll build Sandbox. Okay, and I don't know why this is void. It clearly should be int. I'm not sure what I wrote last time, but let's run this code and see what happens. Now if we run this, we're going to get an entry point not found error. The basic reason for this is because, of course, we're not updating our DLL, which now has other stuff in it. So we need to copy that Hazel DLL to our sandbox and replace the old one because we've built it now. This really should be a post-build step from Hazel, or like a post-build step from Sandbox, really, that does this for us. But you can see that now we get an application that runs kind of infinitely, right? It's not going to do anything because we've just got a while true loop there, but it is kind of loading in the Hazel application. Okay, so now that we've done that, we've actually kind of done the majority of the work here. We've created all these macros that actually either export or import our symbols, and we've written a basic entry point. Now what I want to do is actually inside Hazel make a header file called entry point, which will basically define that main function for us. So entry point.h, and then this is just going to be a header file, which we'll probably just say ifdef. I imagine this entry point will change based on platform, so we'll say ifdef hz platform windows, and we might just stick our error not really required. We could stick this in here, just like that, every time that we do that. But of course, if we have it at least once, especially in a file like core.h, it should just not build if Hazel only supports Windows. Okay, make sure there's no typos. All right, so basically what this will do is fairly simple. It's just going to be this int main function like that, that's going to create our Hazel application for us. Now, this I will fill out with argc and argv. We most likely want this to be winmain on Windows because we might want to retain certain information about how the program was run, just for kind of Windows, like Win32 API purposes, but we won't worry about that for now. Now, what we actually need, though, is some way to create an application. Now, Sandbox, we don't know it's going to be Sandbox, and I don't want to set up some weird like macros or anything like that. So all I'm going to do is say that somewhere we're going to have a something that returns a Hazel application pointer. So extern Hazel application like that, and we'll say something like Hazel create application. I think that will be okay. So basically what this is a function that we will define somewhere else, which will actually return that application for us. So create application is something that we'll implement in the client. So this is all going to make sense in a minute. We're actually going to end up defining this, well, declaring this function inside application.h. So over here, I'm just going to write a function, which is essentially application create application. That's what we'll call it for now. And this is something that is to be defined in client, okay? Which means that inside our Sandbox app, which I'll just pin over here, we need to actually say, basically instead of this main entry point, we need to basically say that Hazel application create application is going to return, in our case, a new Sandbox class instance, right? Which is our actual application that we've built, okay? And that's it. So if we go back to entry point just to see kind of how this will look like, don't worry about any of the errors at all. But this is basically what we end up with. This is an extern that will be found somewhere else, in our case, inside Sandbox app. And all that this is going to do is upon main, oh, well, I actually didn't type any code, that's great. But basically upon main, and we can just order this, auto app equals Hazel create application, just like that. And then we're going to do app run, and then we're going to do delete app. Okay, so this will basically just create our application for us by calling this function, and then it will call the run function on site application, which will do our while true loop, and then at the end it will kind of delete it. Okay, so that is how that works. Now we need to include this entry point inside Hazel, and just to make it kind of really obvious, I might say something like entry point, just to kind of make it, I guess, obvious that this is where it is. And I'm just going to include Hazel / entry point, okay? And then hopefully we will be able to not have to have a main function in here at all. If I right click and hit build, we get a linking error. The create application is an unresolved external. And the reason that has happened here is because, of course, this needs to be a Hazel create application. So we will right click and build that. And then you can see we get no errors at all. And if I run this code, we kind of get the same result. Okay, so the difference, I guess, is that we've actually moved this entry point into being inside the Hazel engine, right? And I could even say something like printf, you know, Hazel engine or something, I don't know, just for the meantime. And if I run that, I might need to actually include something. So let's just include stdio.h. If I run this, you can see that we get Hazel engine printing. So essentially everything is kind of fine. I'll get rid of these two things for now because that was just a test. And we've essentially kind of moved the pain of creating this kind of main function and doing everything properly to the actual engine side. So if we look at our client side, all we need to do is include Hazel, create our kind of Sandbox class, and just write a function which essentially returns this. You could automate this even further if you wanted to, but I quite like this. It's very simple. We can do extra code here if we really need to upon kind of creating our application, but it's just really, really simple, really clean, and you can see that we've basically set up and effectively like an entry point for our entire engine and game. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so that's our entry point done. We now have a basic entry point into our actual application and our engine, which is very important because that's where everything kind of goes from, that entry point. So now that we've defined that, it's very simple for us to actually start kind of building applications, or at least having an entry point into the applications that we build using the Hazel engine. Now, you just saw me try and printf something, and I couldn't really, and this kind of brings me on to what's going to happen in the next episode and our next kind of big task, which is going to be to actually add logging support to the engine. Because logging is one of the most important things that we can do, like at all. We need some kind of feedback on what's actually going on, and just, all the startup information and just everything really. So next episode, we're actually going to use a logging library to start being able to log events and log any kind of information that we need into the console and possibly into files as well. So that's what we're going to move on to next time. I just wanted to kind of define a basic entry point because I think that this in general is something that people just forget all the time. Just being able to actually say, I'm writing an application that uses the Hazel engine. How on earth does that application start? What am I meant to do? And we've kind of defined that right now, which is pretty exciting. Now, before we leave it at this today, I do want to actually push this code to GitHub, and I'll kind of show you guys how I do that just for fun. So I showed the creation of this Hazel repository last time. In fact, it's already got 108 stars on GitHub, which is quite interesting because I haven't actually even released that video yet. But here we have our Hazel repository. Let's actually push all the code that we've done today into that repository. So I'm going to go to this dev Hazel directory, which is the directory of this solution. I'm going to open a command prompt window over here. And I'm going to type in git status just to make sure that everything is kind of fine. Now, the biggest thing that I don't want is obviously this .vs directory. I do not want that to be kind of included at all. So what I'm going to do is actually set up a git ignore. So I'm going to just open VS Code here, and I'll make a new file called .git ignore inside this Hazel directory. You can see here it is. And all I'm going to do is I'll just add a nice comment that just says kind of directories. And I'm going to ignore a couple directories here. So the first thing is going to be .vs, and then with bin and bin int, I'm going to ignore them for now. We will probably commit binaries in some form in the future, so this is somewhat temporary. But now if I run that same git status, you should see that we don't actually have vs or bin int or bin in here, which means I can just simply type in git add asterisk, and if we do another git status, you can see we have basically everything we want. .user is also something I do not want to commit. So files, and we'll say .user. And if we go back here, just to get rid of all of these files that we've just added to Git, we'll just do git reset and just dot. And if we run a status again, you'll see that we don't have anything. So if we do a git add asterisk again and do a status, you should see that we actually still have user because I actually need to add an asterisk at the front there. So let's do that whole process again. Git reset, git add, git status. You can see we no longer have those files here at all, and that looks really good for everything that I actually want to commit. So I'm going to say git commit, and then I'll just basically say set up basic application and entry points. And then I'm just going to do a git push origin master, and then it would actually push it. But I'm not actually going to do this until the episode goes live for everyone, because I kind of like to keep the repository actually synchronized with the video release dates. Okay, so there we go. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, you can hit that like button. You can also help support this series by going over to patreon.com/the Cherno. Huge thank you, as always, to all the patrons that make this series possible. The next episode of this Game Engine series is actually already up for patrons. If you're watching this live on YouTube, you can watch the next episode right now if you just go over to patreon.com/the Cherno and help support this series. Also, all of this code that I've written, I've actually already written it. It's in a private kind of development branch that patrons have access to. So if you would like access to basically the future of this series and like probably 10 to 20 episodes ahead, like where I've already got the logging library implemented and all of that kind of stuff, and you potentially want to help contribute to that kind of series development branch, then you can also help support the series, and as a reward, you'll have access to all of that. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, I'll see you next time. Goodbye.